Episode 1 of Invincible begins with a security guard Steve excitedly talking to his colleague about taking a few weeks off and visiting London. After a touching chat about his recovering son, the Earth suddenly starts shaking as the Mahler twins show up with large miniguns and a bad attitude. They want to kill the president but have plans to do so by making everything a spectacle. Just before Steve meets an untimely demise, a whole group of heroes show up to stop the villains. These are the Guardians of the Globe, and accompanying them is Omni-Man, aka Mark Grayson, who leads the cavalry charge. The heroes help evacuate the area before focusing their attention on the twins. Together they thwart the threat. It turns out Nolan has a son called Mark. For all the worry about Mark's powers failing to manifest, we don't have to wait long before this becomes a reality. After school, Mark inexplicably throws a trash bag high into the sky. Nolan soon learns what his son has managed to and sets Mark up for training the following day. Omni-Man, as we soon find out, is from the planet Viltrum, whose people relocate to various different planets to help lesser species. Nolan happened upon Earth, where he's now tasked with teaching Mark how to fly and land successfully. The latter unfortunately sees Mark crash land in spectacular fashion, complete with a large crater. It's a tough day, one that eventually leads to Mark heading upstairs alone and silent. Desperate to prove himself, Mark heads out alone and takes down a foe called Titan. Unfortunately, he also causes quite a bit of destruction too, prompting Nolan to show and take his son away, specifically to get a new super suit. The orange and yellow merch given isn't quite what Mark expected, but for now it's a good start. While Mark tries to come up with a name for himself, he also starts to doubt his own abilities. In the midst of more life lessons, Mark comes up with a new name for himself, Invincible. As the episode closes, we receive a lovely montage of all these different Guardians and their struggles, specifically seeing them all called into action. These heroes are, of course, all a satirical take on the Justice League and Marvel players. With all the heroes gathered together, the loveliness mentioned before soon disappears. Instead, it's replaced by shock and utter horror. Omni-Man suddenly appears and begins attacking each of the Guardians. Red Rush is completely destroyed, with his skull smashed like a watermelon. Eventually, a blood-soaked Omni-Man takes out all the Guardians single-handedly, leaving them in a bloody heap on the ground. As he looks out at the devastation, he too collapses. Episode 2 of Invincible begins with soldiers from the GDA arriving and transporting the Guardians and Omni-Man to the hospital. It's a bloodbath, and with all of the Guardians torn limb from limb, the director is left with lots of questions. Debbie and Mark are brought in to see Omni-Man, where Cecil Stedman, the aforementioned director, confirms that all of the Guardians have been slaughtered. They believe a supervillain is responsible, but the truth is obviously being obscured here. With hero numbers dwindling, it's left to Invincible to head out and stop an impending alien invasion. It's a nightmarish scenario with hordes of aliens marching through a portal, fronted by Martian Emperor. With all hope lost, a whole new wave of heroes arrive to help Invincible, including Adam Eve, who can conjure pink force fields. Inexplicably, the aliens suddenly start to shrivel and drop to the floor. The root cause of this is still unknown though, at least to begin with, as these flaxen aliens suddenly turn and leave. While they do, Mark heads back to the GDA with a human casualty from this war, bemoaning that he wasn't able to do more. Director Cecil arrives at the crime scene and sees the devastation from the Flaxens firsthand. There, he speaks to Robot, who deduces that these aliens were shriveling up and dying because time was moving faster for them in this dimension. Anyway, Cecil soon shifts across to the Guardian's lair, where Damien Darkblood, a demon detective, touches the blood and manages to piece together fragments of what happened from the previous night. Tellingly though, he's not able to pin this on Omni-Man, at least not yet anyway. Later that day, Invincible arrives to see the Teen Team at their headquarters. This is obviously a cheeky nod toward DC's Teen Titans, but aside from Rexplode and his brash attitude, Mark gets on well with the others. In fact, they even promise to message him if they need his help in the future. Well, that help comes sooner than expected as the Flaxens, led by the Martian Emperor again, arrive back on the scene. This time, though, they're far more powerful and manage to take out most of the Teen Team. That is, until Invincible bursts into action and knocks out the Martian Emperor. With the wristbands holding the key to their restorative health, the group take out the aliens and save the day. With Omni-Man awake, Mark rushes back to the hospital to see his father. Although he's still alive, it turns out the woman Mark saved is not. Nolan brushes this off as a consequence to their job, but Mark is not so nonchalant about this. However, a new threat lurks in space in the form of a Cyclops known as Alan the Alien. Nolan suggests Mark deal with this, leading to him heading up into space to confront him. There, the fight comes to an abrupt end when Alan calls a timeout. It turns out he's an evaluation officer for the Coalition of Planets. He has just dropped by to make sure there are Guardians on the planet, eventually leading to a peaceful resolution between the pair. Back on Earth, the Martian Emperor returns once more, and unfortunately, the third time is most certainly a charm. He touches down with much improved gear, something that eventually sees Omni-Man show up and turn the tide of battle. He knocks the Martian Emperor straight into one of the portals as Mark is forced to watch on in shock. Inside this alien dimension, a slick red and black colored montage ensues as Omni-Man single-handedly takes out the entire realm. It's absolute carnage, and one that sees the scene cut to him heading back home and shrugging off this devastation. As he hugs Mark and Debbie, news suddenly leaks that the Guardians are dead. Episode 3 of Invincible begins with all our different superheroes gathering together to mourn the death of the Guardians. Omni-Man leads the press conference, promising to use the Guardians as inspiration to lead a new team of heroes forward. This ceremony is all for show though, as Nolan takes the others aside for a more intimate ceremony, one that shows where the heroes are really being buried. Among those in attendance is Darkblood, who's determined to find out who killed the Guardians. Meanwhile, Cecil approaches Robot and tasks him with fronting the charge for a new Guardians of the Globe team. He'd be in charge, of course, and only have to answer to Cecil. Enthusiastically, Robot takes him up on this offer. As we soon find out, Cecil and the gang are actually bugging Omni-Man's home, clearly sensing he's hiding something. Inside the house, Nolan is completely nonchalant to the whole Guardians deal, which is interesting because Mark is actually the first person Robot approaches to join his team. Mark refuses, reminding him that Omni-Man wants to train him himself. Instead, Robot launches a series of trials to find his perfect team. With 3 members of the teen team chosen, Adam Eve turns her back on them and leaves. This is thanks to an earlier altercation where Rex cheated on her with Duplicate. In her absence, Black Samson is brought in. Watching all of this drama transpire, including a big fight between Monster Girl and Rex, is Omni-Man. High above, he turns his nose up at them all, calling them pathetic. Amber heads over for her scheduled date with Mark, but things immediately go awry. A ringing phone brings Cecil in to check up on Mark, confirming he has a big mission for the kid. A rogue villain called Doc Seismic is causing havoc over by Mount Rushmore, and it's up to him and Adam Eve to save the day. With no other heroes to call on, Invincible and Adam Eve show up and fight against Doc. The fight goes well, with both of them managing to thwart the threat and stop this foe before it's too late. Mark races back home after an hour's absence and apologizes to a very bored and very fed up Amber. Thanks to some quick thinking, Mark manages to salvage the situation. However, Adam Eve shows up at Mark's door and sees him and Amber kissing on the bed together. She's initially upset but smiles, wishing Mark well in the future. Meanwhile, the Mahler twins are helped out from their cells by an unknown benefactor. Whoever it is pulling the strings, they help the twins escape from their cells. Only, the original double-crosses his brother and sacrifices him, heading off to the big city alone in a bid to create a new copy of himself. As the camera pans out, we see Robot in the GDA control room. This seems to confirm he's playing both sides, acting as that aforementioned benefactor and freeing the Mahler twins from their cages. As the episode closes out, Damien Darkblood arrives at the Grayson household and speaks to Debbie about the massacre. He admits Omni-Man's answers were unsatisfactory, but leaves just as Nolan shows up. Nolan seems to realize what's going on too, playing the Shifty Eyes gig as he looks around the room. Episode 4 of Invincible begins with excavators finding a tomb. Moving the heavy metal tablet in front of the door, a man heads inside and resurrects an ancient spirit known as Kahor. Meanwhile, Nolan and Mark continue to exercise, flying around the globe until they reach Mount Everest. Nolan reveals what brought him to Earth and instills an important message about sacrifice. The pair do eventually head home though, where Mark readies himself for a date with Amber. Debbie begins to suspect something is going on with her husband. Omni-Man's nonchalant attitude toward his neighbor Olga, and how she's selling her house, only fuels her suspicions. In fact, Debbie even looks up Damien Darkblood online to see if his words hold weight. Omni-Man is no fool though, and knows what's going on. He heads off and visits Damien, threatening the demon after he's showing up at their house. Nolan is a little jumpy after this, especially back home, when Cecil shows up and tasks Omni-Man with a new mission. He wants him to escort a manned mission to Mars. After all, Earth needs a win right now. Eventually, Mark volunteers and heads off to prepare. With Mark off on a trip to Mars, Nolan and Debbie go on a romantic trip to Italy. While there, Nolan manages to gain Debbie's trust, but does so while a dragon rips up the roof on a building. The astronauts make it to Mars, where Mark watches them set up their gear from afar. However, he also nods off. When he awakens, he finds the astronauts are gone, having been dragged away by someone or something. This eventually leads Mark to the Martians themselves, and specifically, the Martian Emperor. Unfortunately, the parasitic cichlids there could pose problematic for humanity, and this causes the humans to be sentenced to execution. Mark grabs the astronauts and scrambles back to the ship. While he does, a volley of green laser beams spew around them. Unfortunately, one of these astronauts seems to be infected, but right now that's kept dormant for another episode. Mark and the astronauts make it back to Earth and breathe a sigh of relief, getting back to normality. Damien Darkblood is unfortunately exorcised back to hell, courtesy of Cecil. Well, that seems to be short-lived as we cut to Nolan's closet and hear Damien's trademark growl. To close out the episode, Robot, armed with a blood sample from Rex, arrives before a strange embryo that seems to be growing. Episode 5 of Invincible begins with Invincible himself off acting as a superhero, stopping a foe called Kill Cannon. Only this causes him to turn up 20 minutes late to meeting Amber. This balance between working as a hero and living as a normal teenager continues to take its toll and form the crux of the drama in this episode. By contrast, we see Titan off looking for a specific chip, which, as we soon see, is vital for his boss Machine Head. Titan wants this to be his final job though, but Machine Head is having none of it. This mafia-esque boss reassures him this is his life now and Titan is way too good at his job, so he needs to keep working. Titan heads home and breaks the news to his family. Vanessa and Fiona are not happy, especially given this line of work affects them too. However, he reassures them that he has a plan. This plan involves writing out Invincible's name in yellow paint across his rooftop. Mark does eventually show up, greet Titan once again. Titan wants to overthrow Machine Head, claiming he's stuck in this nightmare thanks to a debt he owes. Mark is conflicted and speaks to his father about the choice he's faced with. Nolan claims helping Titan is beneath him, although Debbie backs up her son, unhappy with her husband's nonchalant attitude. In fact, Debbie is starting to have her doubts about his validity. The next day, she sends Nolan off on a bait errand across the globe. Calculating the distance and speed, this gives her 20 minutes to search the house and look for clues that could link to the Guardians of the Globe massacre. With several minutes to spare, she finds Omni-Man's bloodied uniform. Mark decides to help Titan, doing the right thing and helping out everyone rather than picking and choosing the good guys. Mark does tell Titan they need to make it quick, especially given his date with Amber later on that day. Meanwhile, the Mahler brother creates another clone for himself. While he does, Robot shows up and asks them for help. He wants them to update him on tissue growth, promising to make it worth his while. Back with Machine Head, Titan, and Invincible break in, but their plan immediately goes awry when it turns out our villain has hired a whole bunch of goons to take the pair out. Uh-oh, these superpowered foes are too much for them, until the new Guardians of the Globe show and help turn the tables. At least to begin with anyway. Mark is left a bloody mess on the ground. Black Samson is defeated too, while Monster Girl finds her face smashed in. As the group finally thwart their foes, paramedics arrive just in time to scoop the trio of heroes up and take off. With Machine Head apprehended, Titan double-crosses Mark as it's revealed that he's now going to be in charge of the city. As he embraces his wife and daughter, we cut across to the lab. Their doctors work hard to use Mark's blood as a key to try and defeat the Viltrumites. Nothing seems to be working, and for now, time is running out. Episode 6 of Invincible begins with a drunk frat boy called Doug trying to chat up some girls. However, he's suddenly grabbed by a guy from behind who injects him with a syringe. This happens to be the master plan for a megalomaniac called Sinclair, who wants to make him invincible. Speaking of which, Mark awakens in hospital after a 6-day coma. Monster Girl and Black Samson are still unconscious while Nolan continues to stir things up. He speaks to Cecil and continues to peddle the story that Darkblood is responsible for killing the Guardians. Determined to try and have a normal weekend, Mark invites Amber off to a college. This college, as it turns out, is the same one where that Doug went missing from. Among those in attendance at the lecture is Sinclair, who claims all the students there are stupid and not up to his high standards. After their lecture, Amber and Mark head out and begin spending more time together. Only, this is short-lived when a strange robot begins terrorizing campus. Mark gets changed and immediately fights off this robot as Invincible. It's strong and seemingly indestructible, until it catches a glimpse of its own reflection. With some humanity still left in Doug, he impales himself. Meanwhile, Debbie takes Nolan's supersuit to Art. As they start examining it together, the pair realize that Nolan struck first and was the one responsible for killing the Guardians. They agree to keep it a secret, but unfortunately Omni-Man happens to be hovering around outside listening. With Amber off at a frat party with a suave guy called Kyle, Mark decides to follow. That's a problem because Rick has just been snatched up by Sinclair. In fact, Will is grabbed too. This inevitably causes Mark to make a big decision and leaves Amber to save his friends. As he heads down into the sewers, Invincible finds 3 different robots who all begin fighting and wearing him down. Will is strung up and tortured by Sinclair. His piercing screams, though, are enough for Rick to see through his programming and fight back against his creator. Thankfully, he and Mark thwart the threat together. With everything solved, Debbie confronts Omni-Man about killing the Guardians. She sees through his lies and walks away. At the same time, the Mauler twins head out to a graveyard where they find a pair of teens talking about rumors regarding a superhero. Episode 7 of Invincible begins with Debbie awakening to find Nolan standing with his bloodied uniform on the table downstairs. The secret is out and things are about to get messy. Nolan admits he wasn't being controlled, leading a furious Debbie to tell him to leave. When Omni-Man blasts through the roof, she phones Mark and tells him to come home. Unfortunately, she only gets his voicemail. Just then, Cecil's soldiers arrive to take her away. They arrive at HQ, where the group contemplate whether they can stop Omni-Man or not. Unfortunately, the only person who can stand toe-to-toe with him is Mark, and right now it's unknown if he'll do that. Well, Mark has bigger problems to deal with. Amber completely avoids him after his recent periods of absence and letting her down. After admitting the truth to her about his identity, Amber reveals that she actually already knew. She's more annoyed that he didn't tell her. Defeated, Mark flies away. While all this is going on, Robot greets the Mauler twins and unveils his real plan. He's been growing an organic body for him to move into. That body has been tampered with by the Mauler twins, but Robot is clever. He sees straight through this deception. Robot's mind is essentially copied into this boy's body. His name is Rudy, a child version of Rex. Thanks to the neural link chip implanted by the Mauler twins, Rudy awakens as a human/robot hybrid. The robot we knew before is gone. Rudy can control different robots with his mind, including duplicates of the metal monster we've seen leading the new Guardians of the Globe. He makes quick work of the Mauler twins. Robot/Rudy heads back to the Guardians base and introduces himself. He claims he's done all this to empathize with Monster Girl more. Robot realized that she found Rex interesting, so he modified the boy's DNA in a bid to grow closer. The gang don't know what to make of this, but they're interrupted by big news. Omni-Man is on the move. Our antagonist realizes Cecil and Donald have been spying on him all this time. Nolan is not happy and immediately storms into the house across the street. He grabs Donald and crushes his spine. Just before he dies, Donald presses a button which blows up the house. Unfortunately, it's not enough to kill Omni-Man. While Omni-Man goes on the rampage, Mark talks about his woes with Eve after being dumped. She empathizes with him and gives the boy some sound advice. However, explosions in the distance interrupt them both. Out in the field, Cecil buys our heroes some time, sending a projection of himself to confront Omni-Man. He asks the supervillain just why he killed the Guardians. Nolan has no remorse for what's happened and makes quick work of the cyborgs Cecil sends to fight him. This, as we soon find out, is all a big distraction. He actually intends to use this time to teleport Invincible and Eve to safety. With Omni-Man shrugging off the threat, Cecil is forced to bring in that squid kaiju called Hail Mary as the last line of defense. As Nolan looks set to be killed by the kaiju, Mark suddenly jumps in and gets involved. He's helping his father. At the same time, the Mauler twins revive the Immortal, who's irate and immediately flies off in search of Omni-Man. With the whole world watching, Omni-Man destroys the Immortal. He blasts a hole straight through him and rips the man in half. As he turns to confront Mark, he tells his son they need to talk. Episode 8 of Invincible marks this season one finale with Mark learning the truth about his father. It turns out Nolan lied about his home planet. He's actually part of Viltrum's elite task force, a group determined to conquer planets and make the Viltrum the greatest species in the universe. Mark refuses to engage in his father's ideology, eventually resulting in Omni-Man making a bloody demonstration at his son's expense. Mark is not happy and eventually goes toe-to-toe with his father. It's a brutal, nasty fight, one that sees Mark bathed in blood as the two square off. Nolan absolutely pummels his son, leaving him a bloody mess. In doing so, this sparks memories of the past where Nolan watched his son play baseball. Nolan's one weakness seems to be his affection for Mark, and now he starts to understand this too. Instead of fighting, Mark tells his father that he'll always have him when the world turns to dust. With tears streaming down his face, Omni-Man takes off and flies into space. With the world rocked by the truth about Omni-Man, Mark is kept in hiding for now and taken in for treatment by Cecil and his team. The Guardians of the Globe symbolically head back to their base and wipe blood off the walls. In doing so, they unite as a team and start training. As Omni-Man speeds away from Earth and takes off for somewhere far away, Cecil gently encourages Mark to take over. Debbie is obviously still torn up about what's happened. In fact, she sits in bed and cries. Hearing Nolan liken her to a pet and that she's insignificant has obviously hit her hard. Eventually, she heads back to see Art and sits drinking with him, bemoaning her luck. Meanwhile, Mark is called to an emergency. It's Alan the alien. Out in space, Mark sits with him on the moon as the pair discuss recent events. It turns out there's a coalition of planets, and they're trying to unite a whole bunch of worlds together to fight back against He Viltrumites. Will Mark join them? Back on Earth, there's a whole wave of changes coming. From here, a slick montage shows a variety of different heroes and villains preparing for Season 2. For now though, Mark heads back ready to finish high school.